what does it mean? What does it mean to deepen in our practice? What does it mean for our relationship to the Dharma? What does it mean for our sense of insight and awakening to grow and bloom? Because it's often not talked about so much. It can feel a little bit mysterious, There's this thing in Buddhism, but we don't talk about it very much. So tonight I'm going to do my best to talk some about some different ways of understanding how practice deepens. And my real wish is that whether this is your first time at SF Insight or your first Dharma group ever, or you have been practicing for many, many decades, that what I say will be inspiring, helpful, useful, regardless of where you are on the path. Because these are really extraordinary teachings that the Buddha offered. And sometimes you may have heard it said that the Buddhist teachings can be summed up as, I teach one thing and one thing only, suffering and the end of suffering. And I have spoken quite a bit in the last months about how it is that at the time of the Buddha, it wasn't easy then either. Let's say it that way. That there was a lot of social and cultural upheaval. There was a breakdown of a lot of the traditional social structures. There was a lot of war and violence at the time of the Buddha. And in the midst of all of that, he offered these extraordinary liberative teachings, which give us an opportunity to find a way to navigate the difficulties we face inside, the difficulties we face with each other, and the difficulties that we face, as a species in the wider world. So I teach one thing and one thing only is an abbreviated version of the Four Noble Truths, right? The Buddha said, there is suffering, there's a cause of suffering, it's possible to be free from suffering, and there's a path. And tonight I really want to emphasize the path as a way to talk about this idea of how our own practice, our own realization, our own insight and freedom can grow and deepen. So the path that the Buddha proposed is what's called the Eightfold Noble Path. And the Eightfold Noble Path has three dimensions: wisdom, ethics, and what's called sort of what we think of as meditative practice, sort of the training of the heart and mind. I'm going to say a little bit of a sidebar here because it's coming up, which is that I have felt for some time that many of us, as who, I don't know everyone here specifically, but for many Western convert Buddhists who have taken these 2,600-year-old teachings and begun to engage with them, practice with them in this time and place, there's a little bit of a tilt in the way that the path has been emphasized or underemphasized and overemphasized. And what I mean by that is that there are 8 dimensions of the path. It's sometimes listed 1 through 8 like a line, but it's also often beautifully described as a wheel. And the 8 aspects of the path, the 8 steps of the path, are like spokes of a wheel. And it's interesting because the word dukkha, which is the first noble truth, that there is difficulty, distress, hardship, mm, in our lives as human beings, that that's an inevitable part of what it means to be human. One of the ways that dukkha is described that I like very much because it is very vivid is as a wheel out of round. So anyone who's ever had a flat tire on in a car or a motorcycle or a bike knows what it's like, right? It's kind of like vroom, vroom, right? It's uncomfortable. So when we say dukkha or suffering, it doesn't only mean extreme suffering. It includes that, but it's the whole spectrum from sort of mild irritation or something being a little bit off to, extreme pain or distress or like that. So if we think of this path as being a wheel, it's important that we attend to all the different aspects of the path. And what we have seen, I think, in the last decades of Buddhism coming into the West, but I would say in the US, is that the seventh step of the path, the seventh spoke number 7, has been kind of taken out and double clicked. And that is mindfulness, sati. And there's both an upside and a downside to this, of course. It's wonderful that this extraordinary practice of mindfulness has become popularized and that it is part of the mainstream. It's also wonderful that so many Buddhist teachers and centers have arisen where we can go and practice meditation. There's also a potential, it's not exactly a danger, but it's a limitation in taking sati or mindfulness out of context, right? When we take it out of context, we forget that it's actually part of all these other spokes and that it's meant to be understood in that context. And part of what's ended up happening, I think, is that on one hand, we have mindfulness understood to be, stress reduction or helping us be more efficient at work or helping us like that. And it's good and it probably will do those things. But we miss the depth. We miss the full potential of what's laid out in this path when we pull it out in that way. We also, to some degree, I believe, have overemphasized meditation practice as the main focus of our practice itself. And the integration of practice has been less emphasized. And I say that really not as complaint. I say it as invitation. It's really an opportunity because we have an enormous, there's more that we can do and learn within the context of the Buddha Dharma. And for me, this deep dive Dharma program, the exciting part about that program for me is that that's our orientation, is to take these deep teachings and apply them not only in meditation, but also in our day-to-day lives, in the fabric of our day-to-day lives. And what I've seen is that in this, so we have the wisdom basket of the Eightfold Path, which is wise view and wise intention. And then we have the meditation basket, which is wise effort, wise mindfulness, and wise concentration. And then we have this whole middle section, which is sila. It's the precepts, it's ethics, it's morality, it's virtue. And in contrast to mindfulness getting sort of pulled out and heightened, I feel like for the most part, the ethical component of the path is mostly jumped over. I think for many of us in the West, it feels when we even talk about, ethics, it feels kind of tight and rigid and punitive and maybe even, restrictive, like And we have so much already inner dialogue that's telling us that we're not good enough and we're never going to get it right. And you know those voices that we're loath in some way to pick up these ethical principles that if we engage with them may just make us feel worse, right? And yet it feels to me like these practices of wise speech and wise action and wise livelihood, this is the dimension of practice where we're bringing the practice into our relationships, into our conversations, into our work, into our daily life. Sometimes lately, I have been thinking, and I will say up front that all of what I just said and all of what I'm about to say, none of this is in the suttas. You will not find any of this in the Pali Canon. This is my commentary. So I take full credit. And also, if you don't like what I'm saying, you can just blame me for it. You don't have to blame the Buddha or somebody else. So I have been reflecting that in some ways it feels to me like the whole trajectory of the Dharma is about deepening wisdom. In particular, deepening what we might call wise view and wise intention. And wise view is very interesting because the traditional definition of wise view is the Four Noble Truths. And as I mentioned earlier, the fourth noble truth is the Eightfold Path. So you begin to see, even in that definition, that there's a kind of circularity, right? And this is part of wise view, I believe, that really the whole of the path is a kind of radical reorientation for most of us. And that as we walk the path, that reorientation, basically from trying to get from step 1 to step 8, trying to get from here to there, trying to be or become something, trying to self-improve, that orientation gets flipped on its head. And we discover instead this practice of return, this practice of coming home, this reorientation to, I sometimes think of the path more as a spiral. And as we engage with the different dimensions of the path, our wisdom and our view, our perspective, our orientation both deepens through meditative practice, and it also widens and stretches out into all the corners of our life through that middle section of the path of action and speech and livelihood. And so bit by bit, as we walk the path, our whole life is infused with this, I sometimes describe it as radical reorientation. When we first start to practice, we imagine, as I said, that we're going to get from here to there. The reorientation is, nope, where we're going to get is here. Here. It's in a simple language, it's a shift from horizontal to vertical, right? And what we discover as we begin to drop vertically is that there's no bottom. We just can keep going. I was remembering recently that when I was a younger person, I had this repeated dream. Some of you may have had this dream. It's kind of classic one. Anyway, it was a dream of falling. And in my dream of falling, I was falling like it felt like kind of an elevator shaft. And I would be falling and kicking my arms and legs to try to find something to hold on to. And at some point, I was asleep. when this was happening, I would try to put my feet down, and there was nothing under my feet because I was lying down in bed. So I'd put my feet down and I'd wake up. And I had this dream over and over. And then one time I had a different dream. And in this dream, it was revealed to me that there was no bottom. So then I wasn't afraid so much of the free fall. Because if I'm not going to wake up right before I hit the cement at the bottom, I can just readapt. This is the reorientation to free fall. There's a way in which the whole practice is helping us, literally, it's sort of a paradoxical way of saying it, find our footing in the midst of free fall. There's a way in which we shift from clinging to things as solid, separate, unchanging, to being able to wake up to the impermanence, the fluidity, the aliveness, the ambiguity, the cognitive mind wants everything to be yes or no or good or bad or right or wrong, is or is not. But when we begin to pay attention to our direct experience, what we find is something very different. One of my favorite descriptions of this comes from the opening of a book that some of you may have heard me mention before. The book is called The Famished Road. It's by the author and poet Ben Okri, who is a Nigerian writer. And he opens the book this way. He says, "In the beginning, there was a river. And then the river was paved over and became a road. And soon the road spread out and covered everything. But because the road was really a river, it was always hungry." So many of you may know that in the Theravadan tradition, there is a specific language that's used for a kind of initial stage of awakening, like an initial hit of that radical reorientation that I'm talking about, from separate solid objects to this fluid, alive life. And the term is called stream entry. And it's meant to convey a sense of entering the stream of the teaching, right? You fully entered this. But in my experience and in my understanding, it would be more accurate to say it's not about entering the stream, it's about becoming the stream. At an experiential level, we stop feeling ourselves as being quite so solid. You know, that sense of, this is who I am. This was the Buddha's big breakthrough, right? He looked and for a separate solid I, me, and mine, and he couldn't find one. And what he found was sort of core teaching of what he called paticca samuppada, the dependent origination. Dependent origination doesn't mean nobody's home. It means that what's here is alive. And as Buddhist teachings unfolded over thousands of years, that understanding of the aliveness, the fluidity of, you know, what we call anatta, or no separate solid self, was extended to everything. It became the teaching of what's called shunyata, or emptiness. In other words, not only am I not a separate solid entity, but everything that appears to be so solid, so separate, so concrete is also alive. And for me, and what I've seen in myself and other people is that it's actually quite a bit more frightening to recognize the insubstantiality of objects than it is to understand the insubstantiality of oneself. And actually, there are teachings in the Mahayana tradition where it says when the Buddha introduced the teachings of shunyata, of emptiness, that people had heart attacks or fled, because it was so frightening to hear those teachings. Yeah. So all of what I'm describing is in the spirit of this kind of radical reorientation that we can, as I was describing as we walk the path, we have glimpses of that kind of insight, which we then extend, as I said, into our daily lives, into how we interact with each other, into how we engage in our work life, into how we speak and what we do. This is wise action, wise speech, wise livelihood, this ethical component of the path. So that aspect of the path, which I have been teaching about almost exclusively for the last probably 8 months or so, or a subset of it as the Buddhist precepts, we tend to think of it as being kind of sharp and punitive, but it's actually the heart of the path. The ethical component of the path from the Buddhist perspective is how we care for each other. It's how we bring our practice into our behavior. Feels like we could use more of that in the world right about now. That's how I always feel. Yeah. And then, of course, we can also deepen our understanding in our meditative practice. Because the meditative practice is where we move from the road to the river, right? Where we sit down and we drop below that steady flood of idea, of story, of words, of concepts. And let me be very clear, we don't have to get rid of any of it. Roads are useful. Language is useful. Thoughts and ideas are useful. But thoughts and ideas and language they're constantly defining things, right? And if we are only on the road and we forget the river, we forget the aliveness, then we're hungry. We lose something. We forget our true river nature. And we end up, if you live in a capitalist society, probably you just end up consuming to fill that hunger. And the Buddhist path is an invitation to say, no, there's another way. There's another way that you can satisfy your hunger. And it's not by getting more, or as I like to say, it's not about getting what you want and getting away from what you don't want. It's about fully landing where you are and learning how to be with your experience. It's so simple, and as you know, so difficult. I often like to say the teachings are simple, but we are complicated, right? This is why, at least for me, as a student and also as a teacher, I feel like pretty much I'm saying the same stuff over and over again. But that's not because there's something wrong with you. It's not because you're not getting it. It's because it's hard. It's so simple. What could be simpler than here? And you notice how difficult it is, right? Because off we go. All right. So all of that was preamble to this uh, beautiful description of what I am talking about, um, which is another description of the path, another description of how the path, how our own practice unfolds. And this comes from an old poem from the 9th century Chan master. Let's see if I wrote down his name. Nope. Sorry. I'll have to look it up. Oh, nope. Buddhism started in India with the Buddha, and it moved south into Thailand and Burma, where it became the Theravadan tradition, and it moved northwest into Nepal, Tibet, where it became the Tibetan tradition, the Vajrayana, and it moved east across China and then into Japan and Korea, where in China it became Chan, and in Japan it became Zen. So this poem is from a 9th century Chan teacher, and he describes these 3 phases of practice. This is how he says it. Before I began to practice, mountains were mountains and waters were waters. After I had practiced, oh, Claire is putting in the chat, thank you, Claire, the name of the author of the poem. Before I began practicing, mountains were mountains and waters were waters. After I had practiced for some time, mountains were no longer mountains and waters were no longer waters. After I attained full realization, once my understanding was fully realized, mountains were once again mountains, and waters were once again waters. So let's unpack this a little bit. Before we come to practice, mountains are mountains and waters are waters. We see external objects as separate and solid, right? We see often internal objects as separate and solid, and we hang on to these. We hang on to the ones we like. We try to get rid of the ones we don't like, right? So we hang on to things. We also hang on to our ideas, our beliefs, our points of view, our identity. This is this solidity. This is this road aspect of how things are. And of course, there is some usefulness to it. But also, when we are in the world, this is called the Saha world, the world of suffering, where mountains are mountains and waters are waters only, this is what happens. When we bump up against somebody else who sees a slightly different mountain, or a slightly different water, or a very different mountain. And this is what we see all around us. right? Because when we're so sure of our point of view, of our perspective, then we generally aren't very curious about somebody else's. I think it's really important to say, especially today in this world, and people always ask me this, but what if they're wrong? So I'm not suggesting that you should give up your ideas and point of view. What I am suggesting is that you recognize it for what it is. It's partial. It's yours. And you may love it, and that's fine. What's important is not that you give up what you think and, go over to the other side. What's important is that you are willing to be interested and curious about how it is over there. Buddhist psychology would say that all kinds of causes and conditions came together to cause you to see the world the way you see it. So it's worthwhile being interested to find out, especially when you can't possibly understand why someone could, how could they think that way? Well, be interested. How could they think that way? What were the causes and conditions that came together for this person to see things the way they do? And again, this is not for you to change your point of view or give up what you believe. It's about changing your relationship. And this is the whole deal. We come into practice thinking that we're going to get new objects. We're going to get a better life. We're going to get a better self. We're going to get better. That's not how it works. What happens is that our relationship to everything changes. And that changes everything. This is the reorientation. This is the radical, reorientation that practice asks of us. And it's fine to take it slow. Because I think when we have too much reorientation all at once, then what we get is disorientation. And this is where the second part of the poem is pointing, right? Before I came to practice, mountains were mountains and waters were waters. After I had practiced for some time, I saw mountains were no longer mountains and waters were no longer waters. I stopped holding on quite so tightly to insisting on my point of view, to insisting on things as I see them. As I said, we become the stream. We begin to recognize the aliveness and the fluidity. And again, we don't have to get rid of the road. We just have to remember there's a river there. Actually, there's a river here. You don't have to go anywhere to find it. You just have to sit down. You have to shift your view so that you can see in new ways. Now, what I see in this phase, mountains are no longer mountains and water are no longer waters, is often one of two things. One is that, especially for people who do a lot of deep concentration and meditative practice, that there can become an attachment to these, what I would describe as kind of altered states of consciousness. These are beautiful states of consciousness, but then what happens is people can hold on to them. And this can lead to a kind of spiritual bypassing. Mountains are no longer mountains, so I don't have to pick up my trash, So one thing is that people can get attached The other, as I was saying a moment ago, is that I see for a lot of people, and you may have had your own taste of either of these, is that when we have a wash of insight into the aliveness of our life, when solidity stops being quite so solid, we can get afraid. We can get scared. We can get disoriented. I see this so often for people coming off of retreat. This is, again, I feel like we do such a good job with bringing people in to do meditation retreats, and we don't do such a good job helping people transition back, right? So things open, we see in new ways, but now how do I function? Now what do I do when the things that I thought were so important don't feel important anymore? Or whatever version of that may happen. The good news is that this isn't the end of the story, right? There's another phase. So mountains are mountains. Mountains are no longer mountains. Mountains are once again mountains. Are they the same? The mountains at the beginning and the mountains at the end? Watch what your mind does when I ask the question. Are they the same mountains? The mind, this is the binary mind. Yes, no, yes, no. The answer is yes and no. This is the reorientation, that we no longer have to hang on to it's this or it's that. We're able to begin to straddle paradox. So on one hand, of course, the mountains are the same mountains, but are they the same mountains if we're different, if we see them differently, if we engage with them differently? Then no, they're not. So it's both. I'll leave you with an image that for me describes some of this, and then we can take some comments or questions. So there's this beautiful image I often think of that comes from the Zen tradition of a person who's in the ocean, and their person's head is floating above the water, and they're being flapped around by chop and waves and sun and wind and so on. But this person has a very, very long body that goes all the way to the bottom, where it's dark and still and quiet. So a single person can rest in the bottom of the ocean in a way that allows him, her, them to stay afloat, to learn how to work with all of the chop and churn, internal, external, like that. And that deepening, that feet at the bottom of the ocean, that deepening comes as our view, as our orientation deepens and expands. Yeah. All right. I said enough. So we'll just close with a dedication, taking a moment to check in and see what's here. Noticing anything that may have been touched or stirred in you. Again, feeling a sense of appreciation for yourself, for each other, for the Dharma, and offering any goodness, any benefit, any merit that may have come to any of us, to all of us, opening our hands and our hearts and freely, generously sharing the beauty of the Dharma with all beings. By the power and truth of our practice together, may we, together with all beings, be free from suffering, and may we all awaken and be free.